Have you ever been in a situation where you could have died, or rather you should have died, or you would have died, but you didn't, and you're still alive to tell the tale? I've had this happen to me several times before, and I never really thought too much of it until I came across the Mandela Effect community, in which several people mentioned that they had similar situations where they could have died easily, but somehow they didn't, and they're still here, they're still alive, and in some cases, things like the Mandela Effect phenomenon started affecting them after that occurred. So I'm wondering if this has ever happened to you. Some common examples are car crashes, where someone is in a car crash and, realistically, they could easily have died in that car crash, and yet somehow they're still here and they're still on this planet with us. So one example of where this has happened to me is also a car crash. In my case, it was about 15 years ago, and I was up since early in the morning. I drove a few hundred kilometers from one place to another. I don't know, it's probably a couple of 100 miles. Then I went to work. I was working all day and then doing lots of things and did some more work in the night. Then I went out with someone in the night time, and it was just a really, really long day, exhausting day. And then eventually at night time, it was like 11 o'clock, and I was like, I'm so tired, I'm falling asleep. I've just got to get going. I've got to get home. So I hopped in my car and I drove home, and I was getting close. I was about 10 minutes away from home. I was going along the highway, and I just nodded off. I basically had a micro sleep. I was I was in the process of falling asleep while I was driving, and I was so tired that it didn't really occur to me that I should even stop driving or pull over off the highway and just have a rest for a while before continuing on. I was young and sort of didn't really think about it. I thought I'll just make my way home. Once I get home, I'll be fine. But I was about 10 minutes away from home, and as I was going around the corner on the highway, my eyes just closed, and I felt the car pull off the road, and instinctively I just tried to, turn the steering wheel, get it back onto the road. My eyes were open again, but I didn't really know what was going on. I was just trying to hold on for dear life. I was just trying to get back on the road, but I couldn't. I was going around the corner, and my car had slipped. The left-hand side of my car had slipped off the edge of the road, and I was basically trying to pull it back onto the highway, and I couldn't get it on. The car was basically just taking its own path because it was half on the highway and half in the grass. And then at some points, either I just instinctively let go, or the car took over and took me down the embankment. I'm not sure. It might have been both. But at that one particular instant, I just drifted off the highway completely, and I careered down off the edge, over the embankment, off the edge of the highway, down this steep hill. And I was just hitting the brakes the whole way, and I landed at the bottom. And I actually didn't go very far before I stopped. And I stopped. I, sort of like opened my eyes and looked around, and it was a bit strange, suddenly being, driving along, and then all of a sudden I'm off the edge, and it's like, did this really happen? So I tried to reverse up, but my car couldn't even reverse up that hill. My car was just a small little thing with not a very good engine, and I couldn't even get up the hill. It was that steep. And some guys that live there, live in that area very close by. They came running out and they came to help me. And I got talking with them, and then a tow truck arrived and another tow truck, and the tow truck pulled me out, and it all got sorted. But I was talking to the people, and they basically, the tow truck driver and the people there were saying I was extremely lucky, because if it had been, a second earlier that I'd gone off the highway, I would have gone off the edge of the bridge pretty much and gone down a much, much steeper hill and then straight into the river. It would have just been, guaranteed death straight away. And then if I'd gone off the highway a second later, I would have gone at full speed straight into one of those walls that go along the edge of the highway that block the noise. Big, really tall, really well-built wall. It's all made of wood, but it's really, really sturdy. Nothing's going to take that thing out. If I'd gone into that, I would have been dead for sure. So I just happened to come off of that just that exact split second, at that exact right moment that I went veering down this little bit of a hill, a little bit of a path, where there's just this very short section where there's almost zero opportunity. If you had to try and do it in real life, if you had to try and simulate that situation, you could play, if it was a video game, you'd be playing that game 100 times and you'd struggle to do what I did because it was just so impossible. The odds are so low that the chances of me surviving that thing are just so low, and yet there I was alive, I was fine. And other people saw it later, like my dad saw it later, and he went to this spot and we stopped on the edge of the highway and we had a look, and he just couldn't believe it because it was so such low odds that I could survive something like that. And I was perfectly intact. There was nothing wrong with me. My car was a bit wrecked at the front, but I got it covered by insurance, and the insurance actually decided to fix it. It was actually fixable. So I continued driving that car for another few years. So that's one of my stories. That's my most memorable story and my most obvious story, where I could have easily died. And in any other situation, you would expect someone to have died from that incident, and yet miraculously, I didn't. I just happened to have that perfect coincidental time that I went off the highway at just the right moment, and everything worked out right. So, as I said, this has happened to other people as well. Different people tell different stories, and other stories that I've heard are much more, even more unbelievable, even more amazing. People will talk about situations where, someone a lot older than me was going through a war in Europe in the 50s or 60s or something like that, and there were all these bombs going off, and they were with a few members of their family, and they were trying to get from one place to another, and suddenly the bomb sirens went off, and all these planes were flying over and bombs getting dropped on them, and they were basically trying to run over across the railway lines to the other side and try and hide and find shelter. And then they didn't get there, and then all of a sudden they just heard this loud explosion and everything went white. And for a moment it was like they were dead, or they should have been dead. And yet there was no noise, just bright white light. And then the next thing they knew, they were back in reality again, and they were pretty much where they were. They maybe moved a few feet, a few meters, and yet the sky was completely clear. There were no sirens going off. There was no bombs, no nothing. It was a perfectly clear day. It was as if as if the people who decided to have that air raid that day had never made that decision, and they either delayed their decision, or they done it earlier, or they just not done it at all. And that particular decision had been, in the past, had been changed, which had caused the present to happen in a different way. And suddenly these people found themselves in fear, thinking that they were going to die, and they were just sitting there on the side of the field, and the sky was bright and clear, and it was a lovely day, and everything was completely fine, and that whole situation just disappeared from their reality. And that particular person, I believe, was a Mandela affected person as well. I'd experienced lots of unusual things throughout reality. Yeah, so one of the things that I've noticed with this is that in a lot of these situations, it's like there's a protective force, a protective conscience or consciousness that is almost like looking out for us, saving the day. Maybe it's not our time to die yet. Maybe there was some other thing that we need to experience. And so we're still here in this lifetime. And so associated with these events, you'll tend to find that there's like this protective force, and sometimes you can detect it and sometimes you can't. But when it happens over and over and over again, you start to think like, am I really this lucky? You know, that story that I told before about myself going off the edge of the highway, that was just one situation, and that was probably the most extreme for me in terms of car crashes. But there have been many, many, many other situations around when I was around the same age, when I was not driving very well. I was, I was a young driver, and I was always in a hurry, and I wasn't really super experienced on the road, and I always tended to make bad decisions with my driving. And it is what it is. I'm more thoughtful now, but back then that's how I was. And there were so many situations where I felt like there was someone protecting me, whether you believe that there are other entities that guide us and they protect us, or if it's your higher self or God or whatever you believe, doesn't really matter to me too much, but I felt like there was some protective force there. And there were many situations where there were car accidents, for example, that I just missed out on, that I could have easily been involved in, but I wasn't. So the situation before was a one-off thing. There was no one else on the highway. It was just me. I fell off, I rolled off the highway by myself. But there were other situations where there were car accidents between multiple vehicles, and I was actually late, and so I didn't arrive there on time. Whereas if I was not late, if I had actually left on time when I should have, when I wanted to, when I really, really wanted to, but I was so frustrated that I was late, and I was delayed by a few minutes. But if I wasn't delayed, I would have been in that car crash. And that happened, dozens of times when I was younger. It's happened throughout my life since, to less of a degree, but it still happens. Even this morning, I was, I ran to the toilet. My body didn't feel quite itself all of a sudden, right before I was going to leave, and that delayed me by 5 minutes. And I thought, well, that's annoying. I'm going to be late to work. But then I thought, well, maybe there's a reason for it. Maybe that delay is a beneficial thing. Maybe it's a good thing. Maybe I am being hidden from something that I could have experienced, but maybe that experience is not really something that I would want to experience anyway, or it's not really something that I need to experience. And so it's almost like these little things come up all of a sudden out of nowhere, and they seem so much of a distraction or whatever, and they hold me up, they slow me down, and yet maybe they have a positive or a meaningful reason for being for causing that problem. Scott Schaefer on his channel A Theory of Nothing talked about a similar incident where in one of his first videos where he was in a situation where he was driving to work, I think, or he was going between jobs at work or something like that, and he decided to pull over and go through a car wash. His car was really dirty and really needed to clean. And he thought, he doesn't really have a lot of time, or he might have been going out after work or something. He didn't really have a lot of time, but he thought he'll just pop into the car wash anyway. And as he was going through, he was just getting more and more delayed, and he was going to be running late anyway, but then he ended up being really late because of this car wash. But as he was going through the car wash, there was this situation where he couldn't see anything because of the car wash, but all of a sudden he felt this massive shake, this bang. The whole car just shuddered, and he just thought, what on earth was that? And it felt like it felt like the car shook, like he had just survived a car crash or something. So as soon as he could, he got out of his car and he went to the car in front, and he looked at his car, and he was looking for damage, thinking that he'd somehow hit the car in front of him. And the lady got out, and she was confused, and he was confused, but she didn't feel anything. She didn't know anything about it, but he really felt it. He felt like he had smacked into the car in front of him. But he looked at his car, and his car was fine. There was no damage at all. Looked at the car in front of it. No damage at all. So they didn't worry about it. Insurance, they didn't do anything. They just, off they went, and they continued the rest of their day. But as he kept on driving, after he left the car wash, he kept driving. And then, 20 minutes ahead of him or whatever it was, he saw that there was this big massive car crash. And the time that it had happened would have been more or less the time that he would have gone through if he hadn't gone through the car wash. And the car that hit from behind was smashed up in the way that you would expect if he was the one that had been driving and had experienced that crash. Yeah, it was like what he saw of the crashed car sort of matched, from my recollection, it matched what he felt when he felt like he had experienced the car crash, but he hadn't. So it's like, did one aspect of his conscience or consciousness drive that time and make the decision not to go through the car wash and had experienced that car crash? And as it was happening, as he felt it, his consciousness switched to another frequency or another reality where he had actually made the decision to go through the car wash and to have that delay. And yet he still felt the vibration, yet he experienced a different reality. So it's all different things to consider, but one way or another, it's like this protective force that's helping us or guiding us through life. And one of the things that it does is that it protects us from situations where we realistically would die, but it sets things up, or it changes reality, or it creates distractions or things like this that get in our way, that stop us from doing what we want to do, but actually help us to get to where we need to be. And so sometimes we try and fight reality. We fight with our instinct or our intuition. And I feel like our instinct or our intuition is kind of part of this guiding force, this protective force. It's part of this protection that sort of guides us to where we need to go and what we really want to experience. And yet our brain, our thinking mind tends to think it wants to do this or that. So you've kind of got this fight occurring sometimes between how can I say, like our higher self kind of mind versus our ego mind. Stated in another way, it's like fate. Do we control our destiny, or do we not control our destiny? I feel like it's both, and we can sort of like pick. If we really want to control our destiny, we can, but is that necessarily something we always want to do, because sometimes if we just let our destiny play out, it may turn out better than if we try and fight and control it all the time. People always want to have that control, and they don't want to admit or think of the idea of destiny and not having control of it. But sometimes maybe we don't need to have control of it. Maybe not being in control all the time is a good thing and not such a bad thing. For a lot of people, that seems like a scary idea, that we would not be in control of our own destiny. We're just sitting there to experience things. I feel like we do have control, but like, when do we use that control? We should be more, we should maybe think about it a bit more clearly and not think so much with our brain, but a little bit more with our heart or our intuition about making those decisions. I've gone a little bit off topic here, but it's all interconnected and it's all related. You know, all these situations where we could have died, but we didn't, and yet there's this protective force. It all kind of ties in together, really, to what entity or what consciousness is like looking after us and protecting us as we make our way through life. There's lots of other things that I wanted to say, but I'm not going to go on forever. I think this video is long enough. I may touch on the other points another day. So let me know your thoughts on what I've said today.